The blizzard had been raging for 2 days when Juha Mäkinen stumbled through waist-deep snow to Mikko Virtanen's door, the same neighbor who 6 months earlier had mocked the glass structure surrounding his cabin as the stupidest thing ever built. Inside, where the temperature held at 43 degrees while the world outside froze at -1, Mikko watched the man who had ridiculed him now come begging for help. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The winter of 1856 arrived in Montana Territory 3 weeks earlier than anyone expected. Mikko Virtanen had lived through 7 winters in the mountains by that November, and he knew the patterns. The first serious cold typically held off until late November, giving settlers time to finish preparations, seal cabins properly, and stockpile adequate firewood. But on November 4, 1856, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single afternoon, and by nightfall a bitter wind was howling down from the north, carrying with it the promise of an unusually brutal season. Mikko's cabin sat in a small valley 12 miles west of what would eventually become Helena. The location was good for trapping and offered protection from the worst winds, tucked as it was against a hillside covered with pine and spruce. He and his wife Aino had built the cabin 3 years earlier when they first arrived from Finland. The structure was typical of frontier construction. Horizontal logs notched at the corners, white clay chinking packed between the gaps, a single room measuring 14 feet by 16 feet, 1 door, 2 small windows, and a stone fireplace. The roof was split cedar shakes over pole rafters. By the standards of Montana Territory in 1856, it was a solid, well-built cabin that had sheltered them adequately through previous winters. On November 5th, Mikko left before dawn to check his trap line. The line extended roughly 8 miles through the surrounding forest, following a creek drainage where beaver, marten, and fox moved through the timber. Checking the entire line required 2 full days of walking in good conditions. With snow beginning to fall and temperatures well below freezing, Mikko knew it might take 3 days if the weather worsened. But the furs were their primary income, and with winter arriving early, he needed to know what the animal movements looked like before the deep cold set in. Aino had kissed him goodbye at the door, pulling her shawl tight against the cold air that rushed in when he stepped outside. She was a small woman with pale blonde hair and eyes the color of a winter sky. They had been married for 6 years. She was 28 years old that November. She told Mikko to be careful, to come home safe, and that she would keep the fire burning. He told her there was adequate firewood stacked against the north wall outside, enough for a week if she was conservative. She nodded. She had managed the cabin alone during his trap-checking trips before. The first day of checking traps was productive. He found 2 marten and a fox, all prime pelts. The second day brought heavier snow than he had anticipated. By the afternoon of November 6th, he was working through snow that reached mid-calf, and the temperature had dropped further. He made the decision that evening to cut the trip short and head back rather than complete the entire line. He reached the cabin on the afternoon of November 7th. The snow was nearly knee-deep, and the wind drove ice crystals horizontally across the clearing. As he approached from the east, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten with dread. There was no smoke coming from the chimney. Mikko found Aino on the floor near the fireplace, curled on her side, as if she had simply lain down to sleep. The fire had gone out hours earlier, maybe longer. The cabin interior was barely warmer than the frozen air outside. She wore every piece of clothing she owned, layered one over another in a desperate attempt to stay warm. Her hands were tucked under her arms. Her face was pale, peaceful, empty of the fear she must have felt in those final hours. The firewood was still stacked against the north wall outside, exactly where Mikko had left it, 20 feet from the door. Aino had not been able to reach it. The blizzard had made those 20 feet impassable for a woman her size. The wind, the cold, the blinding snow. She had tried once, Mikko could see from the snow disturbed near the door, but she had been driven back. She had burned everything inside the cabin that would burn. Kindling, small pieces of furniture, even part of a wooden crate. But it had not been enough. The cold had won. Mikko sat beside her body for 3 hours, not moving, not speaking, barely breathing. His mind circled the same thought again and again. She had frozen to death 20 feet from enough wood to keep her alive for a week. 20 feet. The distance was absurd. The waste of it, the preventability of it, carved something hollow in his chest that would never fill again. He buried her 2 days later on the hillside east of the cabin, overlooking the valley where they had planned to build a life together. The ground was frozen, and digging took him an entire day, breaking the earth with a pickaxe before he could use the shovel. Eero Koskinen came to help, along with 2 other Finnish families from settlements within a day's travel. They stood in the cold while Mikko placed Aino in the ground and covered her with the dark Montana soil. Eero spoke words in Finnish, prayers Mikko barely heard. The others offered condolences, told him that frontier life was hard, that death came for everyone eventually, that Aino was with God now and free from suffering. They meant well. Mikko nodded and thanked them and watched them leave, but their acceptance of her death as inevitable, as simply the cost of living in the wilderness, felt wrong to him in a way he could not yet articulate. That night, alone in the cabin that still smelled like her, Mikko sat by the fire and began to think about heat, not philosophically, but mechanically. The cabin lost heat faster than the fire could produce it. That was the fundamental problem. Aino had fed the fire until the fuel ran out, but the cabin had bled warmth into the frozen air outside through every log, every gap, every surface exposed to the cold. The fire had fought the cold and lost because the structure itself was designed to lose. Most men would have accepted this and moved on. Mikko became obsessed with it. Winter deepened through November and into December. Mikko continued living in the cabin, trapping when weather allowed. But his mind was no longer fully present in the work. He had become fixated on understanding heat, on watching how warmth moved and where it went, and why some spaces held it while others lost it instantly to the cold outside. He began paying attention to patterns he had previously ignored. On clear winter days, when sunlight streamed through the south-facing window, the cabin interior warmed noticeably even though the outside temperature remained well below freezing. The sunlight carried heat with it, heat that passed through the glass and into the room. But that heat disappeared quickly once the sun moved past the window. The logs absorbed some of it, but most escaped back through the walls, the roof, the gaps in the chinking. Mikko started watching the snow patterns around the cabin. Snow that fell on the roof melted faster on the south slope, where sun hit directly. Snow against the south wall melted and refroze in cycles, creating ice formations that showed where heat was escaping from inside. The north wall, always in shadow during winter, held snow without melting. The difference was solar radiation. The south side received heat from the sun. The north side received nothing but reflected cold from the frozen landscape. He thought about the glass windows. They were small, only 12 inches square, but they demonstrated a principle that seemed important. Glass allowed light to pass through. Light carried heat. Once inside, that heat was partially trapped because glass also blocked wind and reduced the rate at which warm air could escape. The windows were tiny greenhouses, capturing and holding solar warmth even in the middle of winter. Mikko remembered something from his childhood in Finland. He had been perhaps 10 years old when his father had taken him to the estate of a wealthy landowner near Turku. The man had built a glass structure, a greenhouse, where he grew vegetables year-round despite the Finnish winter. Mikko had been fascinated by it. Inside the glass building, the air had been warm enough to grow tomatoes and cucumbers in January while snow covered the ground outside. His father had explained that the glass trapped heat from the sun, creating a warm space even when the outside world was frozen. The memory stayed with Mikko through December. He began sketching ideas on pieces of bark using charcoal from the fire. What if a cabin could be inside a greenhouse? What if glass walls surrounded the cabin, creating a space between the cabin logs and the outside air? That space would capture sunlight all day. It would act as a buffer, an insulating layer of trapped warm air. The cabin would not be fighting directly against the frozen exterior. It would be protected by a shell of solar-heated air. The idea seemed outlandish at first. Greenhouses were for plants, not for cabins. But the physics made sense. Glass transmitted light. Light became heat when it struck surfaces inside. Heat rose and filled enclosed spaces. If that enclosed space surrounded a cabin, the cabin would exist in a warmer environment even without additional fire. Through January and February of 1857, Mikko refined his thinking. He was not an educated man in the formal sense. He had attended school in Finland until age 12, learning basic reading, writing, and mathematics. His father had been a carpenter, and Mikko had learned practical building skills by working alongside him from childhood. But he had no training in engineering or architecture. What he had was observation, logic, and an obsessive need to solve the problem that had killed Aino. He began calculating dimensions. His cabin was 14 feet by 16 feet. If he built a greenhouse structure around it, he would need clearance on all sides. Too little space, and the greenhouse would not capture enough solar heat. Too much space, and the structure would become unnecessarily large and expensive. He settled on 4 feet of clearance. That would create a greenhouse footprint of 22 feet by 24 feet, large enough to capture significant solar gain, but small enough to be buildable by one man. The height was another consideration. The greenhouse needed to be tall enough to clear the cabin roof and allow warm air to rise and circulate. Mikko's cabin roof peaked at roughly 11 feet above the ground. He decided the greenhouse would need to reach at least 13 feet at its peak, giving 2 feet of clearance above the cabin roof. Glass was the next problem. Mikko needed to know how much glass the structure would require and whether he could afford it. He sketched the greenhouse walls, calculating surface area. Each long wall would be approximately 24 feet wide and 8 feet tall at the eaves. Each short wall would be 22 feet wide and 8 feet tall. The roof would be 2 sloped sections, each 24 feet long and approximately 7 feet from eave to peak. Total surface area of walls and roof. Roughly 900 square feet. Glass panes were typically sold in standard sizes. Mikko had seen them in Fort Benton. 2 feet by 3 feet was common. 900 square feet would require approximately 150 panes. He knew glass cost roughly $1 per pane at Fort Benton, sometimes more depending on supply. $150 for glass alone. Then he would need lumber for the frame, nails, putty for ceiling, hinges for doors, and various hardware. Total cost perhaps $200, possibly more. Mikko had been trapping for 7 years. He lived frugally. He had saved approximately $230. Building the greenhouse would consume nearly everything he had. If it failed, he would be broke and no better off than before. But if it worked, he would never face another winter like the one that had killed Aino. The decision was not difficult. Money could be earned again. Aino could not be brought back, but her death could mean something if it led to a solution that saved others. In early May of 1857, as soon as the mountain passes cleared enough for travel, Mikko packed his furs and began the journey to Fort Benton. The trip would take roughly 2 weeks each direction if weather cooperated. Fort Benton sat on the Missouri River, approximately 120 miles northeast of his cabin, and served as the primary trading post for the entire region. If glass could be purchased anywhere within 300 miles, it would be there. Mikko traveled on horseback, leading a pack mule loaded with his winter's take of furs. He had 43 beaver pelts, prime quality, along with assorted marten, fox, and wolf pelts. The collection represented 7 months of work. At Fort Benton, he sold the entire lot to a trading company representative for $197. It was a fair price, perhaps slightly better than fair given the quality of the beaver. With his trapping money added to his savings, Mikko had $427, more than he had calculated he would need. He found a merchant who dealt in building supplies and explained what he wanted. The merchant listened with obvious skepticism, but was willing to take Mikko's money. Glass panes, 2 feet by 3 feet, were in limited stock. The merchant had 63 panes available immediately and said he could order more, but delivery would take 3 months minimum, possibly 6. Mikko bought all 63 at $1.05 each. He also ordered 80 additional panes for delivery later in the summer, paying in advance to secure the order. The merchant warned him that glass was fragile, that transporting it overland would result in breakage, that he was foolish to attempt it. Mikko thanked him for the advice and paid for the glass anyway. Next came lumber. Mikko needed dimensional timber for the greenhouse frame, something straight and consistent that could be milled to specific sizes. Rough-cut logs would not work for glass installation. He purchased 40 lengths of 4-inch by 6-inch timber, each 12 feet long at 7 cents per board foot. He bought an additional 30 lengths of 2-inch by 4-inch timber for cross-bracing and roof supports. Hardware was next. He needed nails, dozens of pounds of them. He purchased 20 pounds of various sizes. He bought 4 heavy iron hinges for door construction, each weighing nearly 8 pounds. He purchased 10 iron brackets for structural reinforcement. He bought linseed oil for putty making, along with chalk and resin. He purchased a small set of specialized tools, glazier's points for holding glass in place, a putty knife, and a glass cutting tool in case he needed to modify pane sizes. The total expenditure was $343. Mikko had $84 remaining. He used $20 to hire 2 freight wagons to help transport the glass and lumber back to his cabin. The remaining $64 was all he had left in the world. The return journey took 3 weeks. The wagons moved slowly over rough terrain. Of the 63 glass panes he had purchased, 59 arrived intact. 4 broke despite careful packing. Mikko considered himself fortunate. By late May, Mikko had all his supplies stacked near his cabin. The glass panes were stored inside the cabin itself, wrapped in canvas and protected from weather. The lumber was stacked outside under a makeshift shelter he had built from pine boughs. He was ready to begin construction, but before he could start, word of his purchases had spread through the scattered Finnish settlement community. Eero Koskinen arrived first, curious and concerned. He had helped bury Aino and felt some responsibility to check on Mikko's well-being. When he saw the stacks of glass and milled lumber, he asked what Mikko was planning. Mikko explained. He was building a greenhouse structure around his cabin to capture solar heat and create a thermal buffer that would dramatically reduce heating requirements and prevent the kind of tragedy that had taken Aino's life. Eero listened carefully, then asked practical questions. How would glass withstand wind? What about hail? How would Mikko seal the joints? What would prevent the whole structure from collapsing under snow load? These were fair questions, engineering concerns from a man who understood building. Mikko had answers for some, theories for others. Eero remained skeptical, but did not mock. He simply warned Mikko to be careful and left. Juha Mäkinen arrived next, and his response was entirely different. Juha was a loud man, confident in his opinions, quick to judge, and slow to reconsider. He had settled in the territory 5 years earlier and considered himself an authority on frontier survival. When he saw what Mikko was planning, he laughed. It was not polite laughter. It was the laughter of someone witnessing profound stupidity. Juha told Mikko he was insane. Glass was fragile, expensive, and completely inappropriate for frontier construction. A single hailstorm would destroy the entire structure. Wind would tear it apart. Snow load would collapse the roof. The whole idea was backwards. If Mikko wanted a warmer cabin, he should build thicker walls, add more insulation, improve the fireplace. Building a second structure around the first made no sense. It was a waste of money, a waste of time, and proof that grief had damaged Mikko's judgment. Within days, other settlers began visiting, drawn by Juha's stories of Virtanen's madness. They came to see the glass, to hear the plan, to offer their opinions. Most sided with Juha. The consensus was clear. Mikko was building something foolish that would fail spectacularly, probably during the first storm. Some were cruel about it, making jokes about Virtanen's glass palace and the coffin with windows. Others were more sympathetic, but equally convinced the project would fail. A few simply thought Mikko had gone mad with grief and was wasting his savings on a fantasy that would leave him broke and no better protected than before. Only Eero remained neutral, neither encouraging nor discouraging, simply watching to see what would happen. Mikko listened to all of it without arguing. He had expected skepticism. The idea did sound absurd if you did not understand the physics. He simply thanked people for their concern and continued preparing for construction. On June 1, 1857, Mikko began building. He started with the foundation, knowing that everything above depended on getting this part correct. The greenhouse would be a permanent structure, and it needed to sit level and stable on ground that froze and thawed with the seasons. He marked the perimeter first, using stakes and cord to outline a rectangle 22 feet by 24 feet, centered on his existing cabin with 4 feet of clearance on all sides. Then he began digging post holes. He needed 16 holes total, 4 at the corners, 3 evenly spaced along each long side, and 2 on each short side. Each hole needed to be 3 feet deep below the frost line to prevent the posts from shifting during freeze-thaw cycles. Digging post holes in Montana Territory soil was brutal work. The ground was rocky, dense with clay in some spots, and required a pickaxe to break apart before a shovel could remove the loosened material. Mikko spent 4 full days digging the 16 holes, working from dawn until his hands were too blistered and tired to continue each evening. The posts were 6-inch square timbers 12 feet long. Mikko had purchased them already milled to consistent dimensions. He set them in the holes vertically, 3 feet underground, 9 feet above ground. Before backfilling, he braced each post with temporary supports to hold it perfectly vertical. Then he tamped rocks and soil around the base, packing everything tightly to create a solid foundation. With all 16 posts set and the tamped fill given 3 days to settle, Mikko began connecting them with horizontal beams. He cut mortise and tenon joints where beams met posts, fitting them together with the precision his father had taught him decades earlier in Finland. The joints were pegged with wooden dowels, creating connections that would not rely solely on nails. The first set of horizontal beams ran around the entire perimeter at ground level, connecting all the posts at their bases. This created a rigid rectangular frame that distributed weight and prevented any single post from shifting independently. The second set of beams ran around the perimeter at 8 feet above ground, just below where the roof would begin. These upper beams would support the roof structure and provide attachment points for the wall glass panels. Between the lower and upper beams, Mikko installed vertical studs at 3-foot intervals, creating rectangular openings where glass would eventually be installed. Each opening was sized to hold a single 2 by 3-foot glass pane with minimal waste. The precision required was extreme. If the openings were too large, glass would not fit securely. If too small, panes would not fit at all. The roof frame came next. Mikko built it as a simple gable design, matching the pitch of his cabin roof below. Ridge beams ran the 24-foot length at the peak. Rafters descended from the ridge to the upper wall beams at regular intervals. The entire roof structure was overbuilt by normal standards, designed to carry not just its own weight, but also significant snow load. By the end of June, the frame was complete. The frame stood complete by early July. a skeleton of dimensional lumber surrounding Mikko's cabin like the ribs of some enormous wooden creature. From a distance, it looked almost impressive, the geometry clean and purposeful. Up close, the real challenge became apparent. Mikko now had to install 143 individual glass panes into that frame without breaking them, seal them against weather, and create a structure that would hold together through wind, rain, hail, and snow. Glass installation was not common knowledge on the frontier. Mikko had watched glaziers work in Finland as a child, but he had never done it himself. He understood the basic principle. Glass sat in a channel or rabbet cut into the wooden frame, held in place with small metal points, then sealed with putty to prevent air and water infiltration. But understanding the principle and executing it successfully with expensive, fragile materials were entirely different matters. He started by creating test channels in scrap lumber. Using a router plane he had purchased in Fort Benton, he cut grooves along the inside edges of his frame members. The grooves needed to be exactly 3/8 of an inch deep and 1/4 inch wide. Too shallow, and the glass would not seat properly. Too deep, and the glass edges would be inadequately supported. The precision required was frustrating. Mikko spent 2 full days practicing on scrap pieces until he could cut consistent channels that met his requirements. Once he understood the technique, he began routing channels into the actual greenhouse frame. He worked methodically, completing 1 rectangular opening at a time. Each opening required channels on all 4 sides. With over 140 openings to prepare, the routing work consumed 3 weeks. His hands developed calluses on top of calluses. His shoulders ached from the repetitive motion, but the channels were uniform and precise. Next came the putty. Mikko needed a sealing compound that would remain flexible in extreme cold, would not crack under thermal expansion and contraction, and would adhere permanently to both wood and glass. The traditional glazier's putty he had seen in Finland was made from linseed oil and chalk dust. Mikko modified the formula, adding pine resin he had harvested and boiled down from local pines. The resin gave the putty waterproofing properties and increased its adhesive strength. He mixed test batches, applying them to scrap wood and glass samples, then subjecting them to temperature changes by heating them near the fire and placing them in cold water. After 5 attempts, he developed a formula that satisfied his requirements. 3 parts chalk dust, 2 parts linseed oil, 1 part pine resin, mixed to a stiff paste consistency. With channels cut and putty formula perfected, Mikko installed his first glass pane on July 28th. He applied a thin bead of putty into the channel, carefully positioned the glass pane, pressed it gently into place, then secured it with glazier's points tapped into the wood frame. He applied another bead of putty around the exterior edge, smoothing it with his putty knife to create a weatherproof seal. The pane held, no cracks, no gaps, secure and properly seated, but it had taken him 4 hours to install 1 pane. He had 142 remaining. August passed in a blur of repetitive, painstaking work. Mikko developed a rhythm for glass installation that reduced his time per pane from 4 hours to roughly 2 hours. But even at that improved pace, he could only complete 4 or 5 panes per day. The work demanded absolute focus. 1 moment of carelessness, 1 pane dropped or pressed too hard, meant hours of work destroyed and money lost he could not afford to lose. He started with the lower wall sections, working from ground level, where he could reach comfortably without ladders. Each rectangular opening in the frame received its glass pane in the same careful sequence. Clean the channel. Apply interior putty bead, position glass, press gently, install glazier's points, apply exterior putty, smooth and seal. Then move to the next opening and repeat. Neighbors continued to visit throughout August, their skepticism now mixed with fascination at the sheer audacity of what Mikko was attempting. Juha Mäkinen brought friends specifically to watch Mikko work, turning the construction into entertainment. They would stand at a distance, making comments loud. Enough for Mikko to hear about how much money he was wasting, how the first hailstorm would destroy everything, how he would be the poorest trapper in Montana come winter, with nothing to show for his foolishness but broken glass. Mikko ignored them. He had learned early that arguing would change no minds and would only waste energy he needed for the work. He simply continued installing glass, one pane at a time, building his greenhouse wall by wall, while others mocked. On August 9th, disaster struck. Mikko was installing a pane on the east wall when his hand slipped on the putty knife. The knife struck the edge of the glass, and a crack shot across the entire pane with a sound like breaking ice. The pane was ruined. Mikko removed it carefully, set the broken pieces aside, and installed a replacement from his dwindling supply of spares. 3 days later, another pane cracked during installation when Mikko applied slightly too much pressure with the glazier's points. 2 more panes broke in late August when a sudden thunderstorm caught Mikko off guard. He had left several panes leaning against the frame while he worked on channels, and wind gusts knocked them over. The sound of shattering glass was sickening. By the end of August, Mikko had broken 7 panes total and had installed 63 panes successfully. The walls were approximately 40% complete. His spare glass was nearly exhausted. He was now dependent on the delivery of the 80 additional panes he had ordered in May. If that shipment did not arrive or arrived with significant breakage, he would not have enough glass to complete the structure. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the knowledge that winter would return in 2 months. Mikko increased his work pace, often installing panes by lantern light in the evenings, pushing himself beyond exhaustion. The upper wall sections required ladders and were more dangerous. Working at height with fragile materials demanded even greater care, but the approaching winter left no room for caution. On September 14th, a freight wagon arrived with his glass order. 73 of the 80 panes had survived the journey intact. Mikko now had enough glass to complete the walls and roof with a small margin for error. By late September, the walls were 90% glazed, and Mikko turned his attention to the roof. The roof installation presented challenges the walls had not. Working on a pitched surface at 12 feet above ground with sheets of glass required scaffolding, careful balance, and techniques Mikko had to invent as he went. He built a simple platform inside the greenhouse space, giving him stable footing to reach the lower roof sections. The roof frame had been built with rafters spaced to create rectangular openings similar to the walls, each sized for a single glass pane. But unlike the vertical walls where gravity helped hold glass in place during installation, the angled roof meant glass wanted to slide downward before the putty and glazier's points could secure it. Mikko solved this by creating temporary wooden stops, small cleats he tacked to the frame below each opening. The stops prevented glass from sliding until the putty cured and the glazier's points were installed. Once a pane was secure, he removed the stop and moved to the next opening. The process was nerve-wracking. More than once, a pane began sliding despite the stop, and Mikko had to catch it before it slid free and shattered on the ground below. He worked on the roof through the last week of September and into early October. The weather remained cooperative, cool but dry, with no rain to interfere with putty curing. By October 8th, the roof was complete. 137 glass panes total now covered the walls and roof of the greenhouse structure. The building was nearly finished. The door remained. Mikko had left a 6-foot wide opening on the south wall for entry. He built the door as a double-panel design, each panel 3 feet wide and 7 feet tall. The panels were constructed from his 2x4 lumber, assembled into a rectangular frame with cross-bracing for rigidity. Into each door panel, he installed 6 glass panes, creating doors that matched the transparency of the walls. The hinges were massive iron hardware, each weighing 8 pounds. Mikko mortised them into both the door frames and the greenhouse structure posts, creating connections strong enough to support the heavy doors without sagging. He installed a simple latch mechanism that could be operated from either inside or outside. On October 12, 1857, Mikko hung the doors and closed them for the first time. The greenhouse was complete. 5 months of work, $343 spent, 7 broken panes, countless blisters and calluses, and 137 panes of glass successfully installed. The structure surrounded his cabin on all sides, creating a transparent shell 4 feet from the cabin walls, rising 13 feet to its peaked roof. That evening, as the sun set and temperature dropped, Mikko sat inside his cabin and monitored the thermometer he had placed in the greenhouse space. Exterior temperature was 38 degrees. Interior greenhouse temperature was 58 degrees, a 20-degree differential on the very first day, achieved through nothing but trapped solar heat. The impossible structure was built. Now Mikko needed winter to arrive and prove whether his engineering was genius or folly. With the main structure complete, Mikko spent the last weeks of October addressing details that would determine whether the greenhouse functioned as intended or failed catastrophically. The glass was installed and sealed, but the structure needed ventilation, weatherproofing refinements, and preparation for the extreme conditions Montana winter would bring. Ventilation was critical. Mikko understood that on sunny winter days, even with exterior temperatures well below freezing, the greenhouse space could overheat if air had no way to escape. Trapped heat would build to levels that could crack glass from thermal stress or create condensation that would freeze at night and damage the structure. He needed controllable airflow. He installed 4 ventilation panels near the roof peak, 2 on each side of the ridge. Each panel was a hinged wooden frame, 1 foot square, that could be opened or closed from inside using a simple rope and pulley system. Open, they allowed hot air to escape while drawing cooler air in through gaps at ground level. Closed, they sealed the greenhouse into a fully enclosed space that would retain maximum heat overnight. Ground-level ventilation was handled through 6-inch gaps Mikko had deliberately left between the bottom of the glass panels and the ground. These gaps allowed air circulation while preventing the space from becoming completely stagnant. He covered each gap with a wooden grate that kept out animals but permitted airflow. Next came weatherproofing inspection. Mikko spent 3 days examining every putty seal, looking for gaps or imperfections that would allow water infiltration or air leakage. He found 27 spots that needed additional putty application. He also discovered that several of the lower glass panes had settled slightly in their channels, creating small gaps at the top edge. He remedied this by inserting thin wooden shims beneath the glass, lifting it back to proper position, then adding putty to seal the gaps. The door seals required special attention. Unlike the fixed glass panels, the doors would open and close repeatedly, creating wear on the seals and potential for air leakage. Mikko installed weather stripping around the door frame using strips of leather he had tanned himself, creating a compression seal when the doors closed. He tested the doors repeatedly, adjusting the leather until they sealed tightly without requiring excessive force to close. Inside the greenhouse space, Mikko prepared for winter monitoring. He installed 3 thermometers at different heights and locations so he could track temperature distribution throughout the space. He built a small shelf against the cabin's exterior wall where he could store supplies, spare putty, replacement glass panes, tools for emergency repairs, and firewood for the cabin fireplace. He also prepared the ground inside the greenhouse. The soil was bare earth, and Mikko knew it would serve as thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it at night. He spread a layer of darker soil in several areas, knowing dark surfaces absorb solar radiation more efficiently than light-colored surfaces. On October 27th, the first frost arrived. Mikko woke to find ice crystals covering the grass outside the greenhouse. Inside the greenhouse space, the ground remained unfrozen, temperature differential, exterior 29 degrees, greenhouse interior 47 degrees, an 18-degree gain from residual heat stored in the structure and ground from the previous day's sun. November brought colder weather and the first real test of Mikko's engineering. The early month temperatures hovered in the 20s and low 30s during the day, dropping into the teens at night. These were not yet the brutal cold that would come in December and January, but they were cold enough to require steady heating in traditional cabins. Mikko watched his thermometers obsessively, recording temperatures 3 times daily and noting weather conditions. On clear, sunny days, the greenhouse performed beyond his expectations. Even when exterior temperatures sat at 25 degrees, direct sunlight streaming through the glass panels would heat the greenhouse space to 60 degrees or higher by mid-afternoon. The air inside became noticeably warm, almost comfortable. Mikko could work in the greenhouse space wearing only a shirt, no coat needed, while outside the temperature remained well below freezing. The thermal mass effect became apparent within days. The ground inside the greenhouse, along with the cabin's log walls, absorbed heat during sunny days. At night, even as exterior temperatures dropped, that stored heat radiated slowly back into the greenhouse space, keeping it significantly warmer than outside. The temperature differential rarely dropped below 15 degrees, even on the coldest nights. Inside the cabin itself, the difference was remarkable. Previous winters, Mikko had kept his fireplace burning almost continuously from November through March, consuming roughly half a cord of wood per week. Now, with the cabin surrounded by the greenhouse buffer, he found he needed only small fires in the evening and early morning. The cabin stayed comfortable with perhaps 1/8 the wood consumption he had used in previous years. On November 9th, a cloudy period settled over the region, lasting 5 days without direct sunlight. Mikko watched carefully to see how the greenhouse performed without solar gain. The temperature differential decreased but remained significant. Exterior temperatures averaged in the low 20s, greenhouse temperatures averaged in the upper 30s. The structure itself, along with residual ground heat, provided insulation value even without direct sun. During this cloudy period, Mikko conducted an experiment. He planted cold-season vegetables in the greenhouse soil: lettuce, spinach, kale, and radishes. These crops could tolerate light frost and would provide fresh food if they grew successfully. He watered them with melted snow and watched to see what would happen. By mid-November, the plants had germinated and were growing, slowly but growing. Mikko had fresh greens in November in Montana Territory, something that should have been impossible. The achievement was secondary to the heating function, but proved the greenhouse was creating a genuinely different climate inside its glass walls. On November 19th, the first significant cold arrived. Temperature dropped to 15 degrees during the day and fell to 4 degrees overnight. Mikko burned a moderate fire in his fireplace that evening, keeping the cabin comfortable. He checked the greenhouse thermometers at midnight. Exterior 4 degrees, greenhouse interior 31 degrees, a 27-degree differential. His wood consumption for that night, 3 logs. Previous winters, a night that cold would have required keeping the fire stoked continuously with at least 20 logs burned. Neighbors began noticing. Smoke from Mikko's chimney was minimal compared to the thick smoke pouring from their own chimneys as they burned wood desperately to stay warm. The blizzard arrived on November 23rd with little warning. The morning had been clear and cold, temperature near 10 degrees, when clouds moved in rapidly from the northwest. By noon, snow was falling heavily. By evening, wind had increased to what Mikko estimated was 30 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally across the landscape and creating drifts that grew visibly hour by hour. Mikko secured his cabin and greenhouse as the storm intensified. He closed the roof ventilation panels to prevent snow from entering the greenhouse space. He checked that the doors were latched properly and would not blow open in the wind. Then he retreated inside his cabin to wait out the storm and monitor how the structure performed under its first serious stress test. The wind was the primary concern. Glass was rigid but brittle. High winds created pressure differentials that could flex the panes until they shattered. Mikko had built the wooden frame as strong as he could, but he had never experienced his structure under genuine blizzard conditions. He sat by his window throughout the first night, listening to wind howl around the greenhouse, watching for any sign of failure. The structure held. The glass panes flexed slightly under wind pressure. Mikko could see it when he looked carefully, but the wooden frame and the putty seals absorbed the stress. No panes cracked, no seals failed. The greenhouse swayed minimally but remained intact. Snow accumulated rapidly. By the morning of November 24th, drifts outside the greenhouse were 3 feet deep in places. The greenhouse roof, with its pitched design, shed most of the snow load naturally. Some accumulation remained on the glass, reducing light transmission, but not enough to threaten structural integrity. Temperature outside dropped to -1 degree. Inside the greenhouse, temperature held at 42 degrees. Inside the cabin, with a small fire burning, temperature was 65 degrees. Mikko was comfortable, warm, and using minimal fuel, while outside one of the worst early-season blizzards in years raged against his glass walls. He looked at his vegetables growing in the greenhouse soil. They were covered with a light dusting of snow that had infiltrated through the ventilation gaps before he closed them, but the plants themselves were undamaged. He brushed the snow off the leaves. The ground beneath the plants was not frozen. Life continued inside the greenhouse while winter tried to kill everything outside. The blizzard lasted 3 days, 72 hours of wind, snow, and extreme cold. Mikko stayed inside, comfortable and warm, reading by firelight and monitoring his thermometers. His wood consumption for 3 days, approximately 12 logs total. In previous winters, 3 days of blizzard conditions would have required burning at least 150 logs to maintain survival temperatures inside the cabin. On November 26th, the storm broke. Sunlight emerged through thinning clouds. Mikko opened his cabin door, stepped into the greenhouse space, and then opened the greenhouse doors to look outside. The landscape was transformed. Snow reached waist-deep across the clearing. Drifts had buried his woodpile and reached halfway up the greenhouse walls in places. But inside the greenhouse, the ground was bare. Snow that had blown in through gaps had melted. His vegetables were growing. The temperature was warming rapidly as sunlight struck the glass. Mikko heard someone approaching through the snow. He recognized the figure, Juha Mäkinen, struggling through the drifts, his face showing exhaustion and something close to desperation. Juha Mäkinen looked like he had aged 10 years in 3 days. His face was haggard, his eyes bloodshot from smoke and sleeplessness, his hands raw from splitting wood in brutal cold. He stopped at the greenhouse door, breathing heavily from the exertion of walking through waist-deep snow, and stared at Mikko, standing comfortably in shirt sleeves inside the glass structure. Juha's voice was quiet, stripped of its usual arrogance. He asked if he could come inside. Mikko stepped aside and let him enter. Juha walked into the greenhouse space slowly, looking around as if he had entered a different world. The ground was bare. Plants were growing. The temperature was comfortable enough that he began sweating in his heavy winter coat. Juha explained his situation without prompting. His cabin had become nearly uninhabitable during the blizzard. The chinking between his logs had failed in multiple places, allowing wind to penetrate directly into the interior. His door had warped from moisture and no longer sealed properly, leaving a gap that let cold air pour through continuously. His family had huddled near the fireplace for 3 days, burning wood as fast as he could split it, but the cabin never got warm, just survivable. His wife and 2 children were now sheltering with Eero Koskinen, whose cabin was better built, while Juha tried to figure out what to do. He had walked to Mikko's cabin expecting to find similar conditions, or worse. Everyone knew glass was fragile. Everyone had predicted the greenhouse would fail in the first serious storm. But instead, Juha found Mikko warm, comfortable, with fresh vegetables growing in November, burning almost no wood, living through the same blizzard that had nearly frozen Juha's family in conditions that bordered on comfortable rather than desperate. Juha asked how it was possible. Mikko walked him through the greenhouse, explaining the principles calmly and without condescension. The glass captured sunlight and converted it to heat. The air gap between greenhouse and cabin created an insulating buffer that prevented cold from reaching the cabin walls directly. The ground inside absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, moderating temperature swings. The cabin did not have to fight directly against the outside cold. It existed inside a warmer microclimate. Juha listened without interrupting. When Mikko finished, Juha stood silent for a long moment. Then he did something Mikko had not expected. He apologized. He said he had been wrong, that he had mocked something he did not understand, that Mikko had solved a problem Juha had not even recognized existed. He asked if Mikko would be willing to help him build something similar come spring. Mikko said yes, without hesitation. Knowledge that saved lives was not something to hoard. Juha thanked him, shook his hand, and left to rejoin his family at Eero's cabin. As Mikko watched him go, struggling back through the snow, he felt something shift inside himself. Aino's death had driven him to build this, but perhaps her death could mean something beyond his own survival. Perhaps it could save others too. Juha returned to Eero Koskinen's cabin and told his story. He described the greenhouse interior, the temperature differential, the growing vegetables, the minimal smoke from Mikko's chimney, and his own realization that he had been completely wrong. Eero listened with interest. He had been quietly observing Mikko's construction all along, skeptical, but hoping it might work. Hearing Juha's first-hand account validated what Eero had suspected. Mikko had actually solved the heating problem. Within 2 days, Eero visited Mikko's cabin himself. Unlike Juha, Eero came with specific technical questions. He wanted to understand the engineering, not just witness the results. Mikko walked him through the structure piece by piece. Eero examined the frame construction, the glass installation technique, the putty ceiling, the ventilation system, the door design. He asked about costs, construction time, material sources, difficulties encountered, and lessons learned. Mikko answered everything honestly. He explained that the project had consumed nearly all his savings, that glass breakage during construction had been significant, that installation required extreme patience and precision, and that the work had taken 5 months of dedicated effort. But he also explained that the fuel savings were so dramatic that the investment would pay for itself within 3 to 4 winters through reduced wood consumption. Alone. Beyond the economics, the safety and comfort factors were invaluable. Eero asked if Mikko would be willing to provide guidance if Eero attempted similar construction the following spring. Mikko agreed immediately and offered to share his design sketches, his putty formula, and his installation techniques. He emphasized that the most critical elements were proper frame construction to support glass weight and wind loads, precise channel cutting for glass installation, and effective sealing against weather infiltration. Word spread through the scattered Finnish settlement community over the next week. Other settlers visited Mikko's cabin, some out of genuine interest, others simply to see if the rumors were true. Most left convinced that Mikko had built something remarkable. A few remained skeptical, arguing that the structure might work for 1 winter, but would fail eventually. Time would tell, they said, whether the greenhouse lasted or became an expensive ruin. By mid-December, 3 families had committed to building greenhouse enclosures around their cabins in spring. Eero Koskinen would build first, starting in April. Juha Makinen would follow in May, once he had sold his spring furs and accumulated enough capital. A third settler, a man named Henrik Laksonen, who lived 15 miles south, planned to begin construction in June. Mikko met with all 3 families, providing them with detailed measurements, material lists, and construction sequence information. He warned them about the challenges. Glass was expensive and fragile. Construction required careful work that could not be rushed, and mistakes would be costly. But for families who had struggled through previous winters, burning massive quantities of wood while still barely staying warm, the investment made sense. The phrase Virtanen greenhouse began circulating among the Finnish settlers, a term that would persist for decades. December brought the coldest weather of the season. Temperatures dropped into negative territory and stayed there for days at a time. On December 18th, the temperature reached negative 18 degrees, the coldest night Mikko had recorded in 7 years in Montana. Traditional cabins became barely habitable ice boxes. Families wore every piece of clothing they owned indoors. Fires burned continuously, consuming wood at unsustainable rates. People slept in shifts near the fireplace because sleeping in beds away from the fire meant waking with frost on your blankets. Mikko woke on the morning of December 19th in his cabin, which had maintained an interior temperature of 58 degrees overnight, with a fire that had burned down to coals hours earlier. The greenhouse temperature was 31 degrees. The exterior was still negative 15, a 46-degree differential between outside and greenhouse. The cabin, surrounded by that greenhouse buffer, had stayed comfortable with minimal heating. He walked into the greenhouse space wearing only trousers and a shirt. His breath did not fog. The temperature was above freezing despite the brutal cold outside. He checked his vegetable plants. They were thriving. Lettuce, spinach, and kale were growing at rates comparable to autumn conditions. He harvested several leaves for his breakfast, fresh greens in late December at negative 15 degrees exterior temperature. Throughout January and February, the pattern continued. The greenhouse maintained temperature differentials ranging from 35 to 50 degrees depending on weather conditions. Sunny days brought greenhouse temperatures into the 60s even when outside air was below zero. Cloudy days reduced solar gain, but the structure still provided 20 to 30 degrees of buffer warmth. Night temperatures in the greenhouse rarely dropped below 25 degrees, regardless of how cold the exterior became. Mikko's wood consumption for the entire winter would total approximately 2 cords compared to the 8 to 10 cords he had burned in previous years. The savings represented roughly $120 worth of labor and time that he did not have to spend cutting, splitting, hauling, and stacking firewood. The greenhouse had paid for 1/3 of its construction cost in the first winter alone. More significantly, Mikko experienced comfort and safety he had never known in previous winters. He was never cold. He never worried about running out of firewood. He never faced the desperate dawn calculation of whether to go out in dangerous weather to gather more wood, or try to conserve fuel and hope the cold broke before hypothermia set in. The engineering had eliminated the problem rather than simply managing it. Other settlers were not so fortunate. Mikko heard stories through the scattered community of families who had nearly frozen, of children who developed frostbite, sleeping in their own cabins, of men who had died while out gathering firewood in blizzard conditions. The winter of 1857 through 58 was brutal across Montana territory. But for Mikko, surrounded by his glass walls, it was the warmest winter he had experienced since arriving in the mountains. Spring arrived in late March of 1858, and with the thaw came renewed interest in Mikko's greenhouse design. Eero Koskinen began construction in early April, following the techniques Mikko had shared. Mikko visited Eero's site several times during the building process, offering advice on frame construction, glass handling, and sealing methods. Eero's greenhouse took shape more quickly than Mikko's had, benefiting from the lessons Mikko had learned through trial and error. By late May, Eero's structure was complete. His design differed slightly from Mikko's, adapted to his cabin's dimensions and the materials he had available, but the core principles remained identical. Glass envelope surrounding the cabin, air gap creating thermal buffer, pitched roof for snow, shedding, ventilation for temperature control. When winter returned in November of 1858, Eero's family experienced the same dramatic fuel savings and comfort that Mikko had achieved. Juha Makinen started his greenhouse in June, and a third settler, Henrik Laaksonen, began construction in July. Word of the innovation spread beyond the immediate Finnish community. A traveling trapper named Lauri Nieminen passed through the area in August, saw Mikko's greenhouse, and asked detailed questions about the design. Lauri was heading south toward the Wyoming Territory and said he would tell others about what he had seen. By the fall of 1858, 4 greenhouse-wrapped cabins existed in western Montana Territory. By the spring of 1860, that number had grown to 9. The design spread through word of mouth among trappers, settlers, and traders who moved through the region. Not everyone who heard about it built one. The technique required capital that many frontier families lacked, along with access to glass and the skill to install it properly. But those who had the resources and faced the harshest winter conditions increasingly considered greenhouse construction worthwhile. The innovation became known by various names depending on who was describing it. Some called it the Virtanen greenhouse, after Mikko. Others referred to it as the Finnish envelope, or simply glass cabin construction. The terminology varied, but the concept remained consistent, surrounding a cabin with a glass structure to create passive solar heating and thermal buffering that dramatically reduced fuel requirements. Mikko never tried to profit from his innovation or claim exclusive rights to the technique. He shared his knowledge freely with anyone who asked, believing that solutions to survival problems should not be hoarded. He helped at least a dozen families with design advice, material recommendations, and construction guidance over the following 5 years. Some of those families would certainly have lost members to winter cold, without the protection the greenhouses provided. The exact number of lives saved by Mikko's innovation is impossible to calculate. Survival often goes unrecorded. But accounts from the period include multiple references to families surviving severe winters, specifically because their greenhouse-wrapped cabins maintained livable temperatures while traditional structures around them became death traps. Conservative estimates suggest at least 15 to 20 lives were saved over the following 2 decades because people built structures based on Mikko's design. Mikko Virtanen lived in his greenhouse-wrapped cabin until 1873, 17 years after Aino's death. He never remarried. He continued trapping for several years, then gradually transitioned to working as a carpenter and construction advisor for new settlers moving into the territory. His greenhouse remained in excellent condition throughout, those years requiring only minor maintenance. Occasional glass replacement from branches falling during storms, periodic resealing of putty, and standard repairs to the wooden frame. In 1873, at age 51, Mikko died quietly in his sleep during an autumn night. Eero Koskinen found him 3 days later when Mikko failed to appear for a planned meeting. Eero buried Mikko on the hillside next to Aino, marking both graves with carved wooden markers that faced east toward the sunrise. The cabin and greenhouse passed to a young Norwegian family who had recently arrived in Montana. They lived in the structure for another 12 years, marveling at its warmth and efficiency. When they eventually moved to a larger property, the cabin was occupied by successive settlers for several more decades. The greenhouse remained functional until approximately 1900, when neglect and a severe hailstorm finally destroyed enough glass panels that the structure was no longer weather-tight. The wooden frame stood for another 20 years before finally collapsing from rot and age. Modern historians discovered the site in 1968 during a survey of early frontier settlements. They found the foundation post holes, fragments of glass embedded in the soil, rusted iron hardware, and Finnish-made tools that had belonged to Mikko. The pattern of post holes and glass distribution made clear what the structure had been. Subsequent research uncovered written references to Virtanen's glass cabin in territorial records and personal journals from the 1860s and 70s, confirming the story that had become somewhat legendary in local history. The innovation Mikko developed demonstrated several enduring principles about frontier survival and human ingenuity. First, effective solutions often come from applying known techniques in novel ways rather than inventing entirely new technology. Greenhouses existed for centuries before Mikko built his. His genius was recognizing that greenhouse principles could solve a cabin heating problem. Second, tragedy can drive innovation that benefits far more people than just the innovator. Aino's death created the obsession that led Mikko to engineering a solution that saved other families from similar fates. Third, and perhaps most importantly, surviving harsh environments is less about toughness or endurance than about changing the fundamental equation. Mikko did not try to become tougher or burn more wood or accept that winter cold was simply something to survive. He eliminated the problem by creating a structure that made extreme cold irrelevant. That approach, engineering over endurance, represents a kind of frontier wisdom that often goes unrecognized in stories that emphasize individual toughness over practical intelligence. The greenhouse that neighbors had mocked became the shelter that saved lives. The glass walls that seemed fragile proved stronger than log walls alone, and the man who lost everything found a way to ensure others would not suffer the same loss.